I have to say that when I come out to address new audiences, I sometimes worry a little more about the introduction than about the actual speech itself. Because you never know these days what people might say, especially if they look you up on the internet, since not all those who introduce speakers have realized that the internet might give you credit for things you've never actually done. Or otherwise, in fact, I have a friend in New York who likes introducing speakers, not just by any accomplishments they may actually have, but what he can find out about them up the family tree, you know, the misdeeds of ancestors long forgotten. Well, in one particular instance, he found that the distinguished speaker he was about to introduce had an uncle, I think it was, who was executed in Sing Sing prison for kidnapping and armed robbery, something equally horrible. Anyway, having taken the trouble to look this up, he felt he had to use it. So he said, now, a distinguished lecturer had an uncle who occupied the chair of applied electricity at one of the nation's leading institutions. Which is just my way of saying that there are always nice ways of saying things that one may or may not have done, but I'm most grateful for the very generous spirit in which you presented me to your audience. Well, it really is a pleasure to be here at Duke and to taste a little bit of your renowned hospitality before returning to the tyranny of the daily pressures that confront our organization. And I hope you noticed that I said our organization. I'm well aware and not a little daunted by the knowledge that the famed research triangle of which this university is undoubtedly the apex now has more PhDs per capita than anywhere else in the world. And in a room full of experts, I'm unlikely to get away with inaccurate language. But when I said our organization, I wasn't being careless. I call the UN our organization because I firmly believe that the UN is your organization as much as it is mine. The UN Charter belongs to the whole world, and the organization set up to deliver on the promise of that charter contributes, in my view, to the well-being of every one of us in it. You've been kind enough to invite me to give this lecture today and to speak in honor of a noble North Carolinian on the subject of the future of the United Nations. Not always a popular subject in North Carolina. We also know that speaking about the future of anything is not always an easy task, since the future is never quite what it used to be. I know that there are indeed some people who in recent times have dismissed the importance of the United Nations and even suggested that it may not have a future. And dare I even say that there might even be some people in North Carolina who have expressed such a view, particularly in moments when they've held electoral office, which is why my topic has the title that it does. But in all seriousness, the divisions in the Security Council over Iraq in 2003 were particularly relevant here because that did lead some to evoke a parallel with the League of Nations, a body that had been created with great hopes at the end of the First World War, but which was reduced to debating the standardization of European railway gauges the day the Germans marched into Poland. But such comparisons are, in my view, a little overstated. In fact, as Mark Twain put it when he saw his own obituary in the newspaper, I do think the reports of our demise are exaggerated. And yet we live with a paradox, particularly here in the world's only superpower. Independent public opinion polls over many years have consistently found that ordinary Americans have great faith in the United Nations and in multilateral solutions to world problems. But leaders and legislators in the US, not only from North Carolina, have not always shared their constituents' faith. In fact, on a visit to Washington, D.C. some years ago, I asked a distinguished Washingtonian what lay behind all the hostility and criticism that we kept hearing towards the UN in those days. I said, didn't the critics understand what we were all about, what we were trying to do? I said, what's the problem here? Is it ignorance or is it apathy? And he replied, I don't know and I don't care. It sort of sums up the problem we have. But here at Duke, where knowledge is clearly at a premium, I think I can safely assume that you care, or at least that you want to know. So, on the assumption that the best crystal ball is often a rearview mirror, an assumption that I trust Professor Kuhneholm and his fellow historians will endorse, let me venture a little into history. The United Nations was founded during a period when the world had known almost nothing but war and strife. If you take the 45-year, or even the 40-year period from 1905 to 1945, you had this absolutely horrendous period of human history, bookended, of course, by the two savage world wars that began within 25 years of each other. In the first half of the 20th century, in fact, people in most parts of the world scarcely had the luxury that many undergraduates here have of deciding whether you're interested in world politics, because world politics took a thoroughly intrusive interest in them at that point. And of course, horror succeeded horror, until in 1945 the world was brought face to face with the terrible tragedies wrought by war, fascism, genocide, and nuclear bombing. Had things gone on like that, the future of the human race would have been bleak indeed. Happily, they did not go on like that. The second half of the 20th century, we all know, was far from perfect. But it was a spectacular improvement on the first half, that first half that had ended with the Holocaust and Hiroshima. I don't deny that civil wars and certainly even international wars have continued. There have been terrible atrocities in the second half of the 20th century. Partition of India, the rule of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, genocide in Rwanda. You can all pick your favorite or least favorite examples of human horrors. And we also know that billions of people still live in extreme and degrading poverty. And yet, the overall record of the second half of the 20th century is actually one of amazing advances. The world economy not only recovered from the devastation of 1945, it expanded as never before. There was also astonishing technological progress. Many in the industrialized world, including, I suspect, pretty much everyone in this room, enjoy a level of prosperity and have access to a range of experiences that our grandparents could scarcely have dreamt of. And even in the developing world, there's been spectacular economic growth. Child mortality has been reduced pretty much everywhere. Literacy has spread. The peoples of the so-called Third World threw off the yoke of colonialism, and those of the Soviet bloc won political freedom. Democracy and human rights are not yet universal, as we all know, but they're now much more the norm than the exception. And did all this happen by accident? No. It happened because in the aftermath of the Second World War, a group of far-sighted leaders were determined to make the second half of the 20th century different from the first. They saw that the human race had only one world to live in, that unless it managed its affairs differently, all human beings in that one world would suffer. Indeed, might perish. And their idea, which we now call global governance, was to create an international architecture that would foster cooperation among states, elaborate consensual global norms, and establish predictable, universally applicable rules to the benefit of all. And the keystone of that arch, so to speak, was the United Nations itself. The UN was seen by visionaries like the great American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the only possible alternative to the disastrous experiences of the first half of the century. In fact, as FDR stated in his historic speech to the two US Houses of Congress after the Yalta Conference, the UN, and I'm paraphrasing here, could provide an alternative to the arms races, the military alliances, the balance of power politics, and all the arrangements that had led to war so often in the past. Now, in the view of people like FDR, the new UN would stand for a different sort of world, a world in which people of different nations and cultures could look on each other not, as they had done in the preceding few decades, as subjects of fear and suspicion, but rather as potential partners, able to exchange goods and ideas to their mutual benefit. A place where small states and big would be able to work as sovereign equals, pursuing common objectives in a universal forum. And it would provide a means to address what we sometimes these days like to call problems without passports, problems that cross frontiers uninvited, like drug trafficking, terrorism, of course, epidemics of dreaded diseases, refugee movements, and so on, climate change, problems whose solutions too can not have any passports, because no one country or one group of countries, however rich or powerful, can tackle them alone. In fact, FDR's successor, Harry Truman, put it very clearly, and I'm going to quote his actual words here. "You have created a great instrument for peace and security and human progress in the world," he declared to the assembled signatories of the UN Charter in San Francisco on June 26, 1945. If we fail to use it, he went on, we shall betray all those who have died in order that we might meet here in freedom and safety to create it. If we seek to use it selfishly for the advantage of any one nation or any small group of nations, we shall be equally guilty of that betrayal, unquote. That was then, of course, and this more than 60 years later is now. How many of today's critics of the United Nations would even recognize the voice of an American president in Truman's speech that historic day? We all have to recognize, he declared, and I quote again, no matter how great our strength, that we must deny ourselves the license to do always as we please. No one nation, Truman said, can or should expect any special privilege which harms any other nation. Unless we are all willing to pay that price, no organization for world peace can accomplish its purpose. And what a reasonable price that is, unquote. I suspect that there are many, and not just in Washington today, who would not agree that this is indeed a reasonable price for the world's only superpower to pay in the interest of something as amorphous as world peace, especially in an era of terrorism. And though, as Professor Cunningham pointed out, the climate appears to be changing in the last year or so, it is still in the United States, above all, that the organization has suffered most. Perhaps part of the problem lies in the expectations that many organizations have for the World Organization. That many Americans have for the World Organization. In fact, if the UN was good for anything, declared Representative Roscoe Bartlett of Maryland after the debates on Iraq 3 or 4 years ago, he said if the UN was good for anything, it would be for something like this, in other words, Iraq. Since the UN was no good for this, maybe they're good for nothing. This was after the Security Council failed to vote to support the war in Iraq. Now, there is, of course, a more fundamental American critique of the place of the United Nations in today's world, and it's right to raise that in a lecture at a School of Public Policy, or Institute of Public Policy. Soon we hope to become a school. The notion has gained ground in the wake of particularly Robert Kagan's Of Paradise and Power, that the elemental issue in world affairs in the last few years, in world affairs today even, is the incompatibility of the European and what he calls a European and American diagnoses of our contemporary geopolitical condition. In this view, which Kagan is the best known exponent of, but by no means the only one, the US sees a Hobbesian world, rife with menace and disorder, that requires the imposition of order and stability by a Leviathan, while Europe and much of the rest of the world imagines a Kantian world of peace and rationality, which can be managed by reasonable-minded leaders coming to sensible arrangements through institutions like the United Nations, and no doubt probably speaking French in the process. Now, since this latter view is a fantasy, such analysts suggest, the institutions underpinning it are equally impractical and ineffectual. In the real world, a Hobbesian Leviathan could not possibly function if he were to be tied down by a system of rules designed to serve smaller states. He would be a Gulliver restrained by, and I'm quoting Charles Krautheimer's words, the myriad strings of the Lilliputians that diminish his overweening power, unquote. So for these people, these analysts, the answer lies in disregarding the United Nations. And as Michael J. Glennon argued in Foreign Affairs magazine, restoring might, I'm paraphrasing him really, restoring might to its rightful place in world affairs. Now, there are many flaws in this argument, but the key one lies in its central premise. For the United Nations was not created just by starry-eyed Kantians. It was actually established as a response to a Hobbesian world. And it was established by the allies who'd won the war that dealt with this Hobbesian world. The media call them the Allies, but the Allies called themselves the United Nations from 1943 onwards. It was a wartime organization that was converted by the victors into a peacetime body. And that is something that people should not forget, because these leaders saw the Hobbesian savagery of the preceding 3 decades, and they vowed never again. But the solution, the Leviathan, imagined by the visionary statesmen of that era, notably by FDR himself, was not a single power acting as a global hegemon. It was instead a system of laws that would ensure that, as I said earlier, the world of the second half of the 20th century would be a better place than the one that had barely survived the first half. In fact, so great was the perceived American stake in such a system that the US became its principal financial contributor, paying as much as 50% of the UN's regular budget in the first years of the organization, a figure astonishing to recall at a time when so much American diplomatic energy was recently invested in reducing its current share from 25% to 22%. At that point, Gulliver was to lead the Lilliputians, not feel tied down by them. They provided him, in other words, with a springboard, not a rack. And the world for which these leaders and all the allies had fought was meant to be a world of increasing openness, of imperial contraction making way for the expansion of freedom, of growing mutual confidence, above all, a world of hope. Now that hope certainly seemed to have dimmed in the early years of the 21st century, and at the time of the Iraq debates, it couldn't have been worse. In fact, a Pew poll, the Pew organization took a poll in 20 countries just after the successful conquest of Baghdad in mid-2003, and that poll showed that the UN had suffered a great deal of collateral damage over Iraq. The UN's credibility was down in all 20 countries surveyed. It was down in the US because the UN had not supported the administration on the war, and was down in the 19 other countries because the UN could not prevent the war. So we got hit from both sides of the debate. We disappointed both sets of expectations. And that was when this whole question of whether the UN had a future began to be raised. I still remember a BBC interviewer interrupting something I was saying and saying to me, "So how do you folks at the UN feel about being the I word, irrelevant?" And I cut him short, responding, "Well, for me, the I word is not irrelevant, it's indispensable." And that wasn't just a debating point, because of course we acknowledge the UN has never been and probably never will be a perfect body. It has acted unwisely at times. It's failed to act at others. We can each find examples of the UN's failures and setbacks, and as you know, Professor Cunningham gave an admirable summary of all the nasty things you can say about the UN in one sentence. But the point is that the UN at its best and its worst is a mirror of the world. It reflects our divisions and our disagreements, but also our hopes and our convictions. The good professor quoted me quoting Dag Hammarskjöld, and it's worth repeating. The UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but rather to save humanity from hell. Sometimes that's the best it can do, preventing things from getting worse. But that it has. Some people forget that the UN has achieved an enormous amount in its first 60 years. Most important of all, it helped prevent the Cold War from turning hot. First, by providing a roof under which the two superpower adversaries could meet and engage. And second, by mounting peacekeeping operations that ensured that local and regional conflicts were contained and did not ignite a superpower clash that could have sparked off a global conflagration. Indeed, and again, Professor Cunningham has mentioned the 170 UN-assisted peace settlements, the 300 international treaties. All of this we can talk about, and frankly we do, but the important thing is that all of these efforts created an international framework that has effectively reduced the prospect for conflict among sovereign states. It's striking to realize that today, right now, if you look around the world, there is no single war going on between states, not one. There's plenty of conflict. It's within states. There's not anything going on between states. And the UN has, in addition to being able to preside over such an era, it has built global norms that are universally accepted in areas as diverse as decolonization and disarmament, development and democratization. And the UN, of course, also remains second to none in its unquestioned experience, leadership and authority in coordinating humanitarian action, from tsunamis to human waves of refugees. When the blue flag flies over a disaster zone, everyone knows that humanity is taking responsibility, not any one government. And when the UN succeeds, the whole world wins. Indeed, many UN agencies have established a global reputation for excellence in delivering aid, notably UNICEF, which helps children, my own organization, UNHCR, the first one I joined, and I'm so proud to see a former colleague and friend from UNHCR, Susan Carroll, sitting in this room, UNHCR, which protects and assists refugees, the World Food Programme, the World Health Organization, all of which have been in the forefront of global efforts to address international crises and disasters for 6 decades. Now, what makes the UN effective at this kind of work? I found out for myself more than a quarter of a century ago, as a young man running the UNHCR office and the refugee camp that went with it, in Singapore at the peak of the Vietnamese boat people crisis. Now, it was obvious that some of the things I did could have been done just as well by non-governmental organizations, church groups, compassionate individuals, all of whom I indeed enlisted in the cause as partners, as donors, as volunteers at the refugee camp. But the UN could also do things that these good folks simply could not, because as an intergovernmental body, the UN has clout with its member states. So in my own experience, what happened? Only the UN could negotiate with the Singapore government the terms under which refugees rescued at sea could be brought into the port. Only the UN could arrange their disembarkation. Only the UN was allowed to be responsible for the camp. Only the UN could work out the guarantees of resettlement in foreign countries without which the refugees would not have been allowed to disembark. Only the UN in the end could persuade immigration officials from a dozen foreign countries to admit refugees and resolve problem cases. Every week I used to have a meeting in my office where the immigration officials from a dozen embassies would sit around me, literally go through lists of refugees, and I'd persuade them to take people. It's an extraordinary thing, and frankly, I realized through my own work that the UN wasn't just a way of bureaucratizing our consciences. I could put my head to the pillow every night knowing that the work I was doing on behalf of the UN was making a real difference to the lives of real human beings. Equally important, the UN enjoys the support of governments precisely because it does not belong to any single one of them. Whenever donors jostle for attention or national interests threaten to take center stage, everyone prefers the UN because it embodies the collective interest. Many organizations must bring their expertise to bear on major humanitarian disasters like the Asian tsunami, but only the UN is unchallenged as the coordinating authority. It's a truism that no government likes to give in or play second fiddle to another government. Why should they? But they can all serve under a common flag that represents everyone. And that applies when individuals act on behalf of the UN as well. The same American expert or Chinese advisor or German aid worker is easier for a sensitive government to admit when he or she arrives as a UN official rather than as a national representative. That's the essence of what we call the legitimacy issue. Because of its universality, the UN enjoys a standing in the eyes of the world that gives its collective actions and decisions a legitimacy that no individual government enjoys beyond its own borders. I became a bit of an object of hate in the blogosphere here when I wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine that the difference between a sort of coalition of the willing and a United Nations authorized force is the difference between a police squad and a posse. And that didn't make me very popular in certain circles, but my rather lengthy explanation was to explain that thought, that there is a difference in the legitimacy that comes from a UN-mandated operation that belongs to all governments, and one where essentially one government or one group of governments is stringing together its own enforcement action. So, as I've said, the UN's record may not be perfect, but it's proven highly successful, highly useful, and what's more, according to a 2005 RAND Corporation study of peacekeeping and nation building, it's also an extremely cost-effective institutional framework, something like a fourth as expensive, in other words, one-fourth the cost of US-led efforts in comparable areas. Now, these are all achievements we can build on. And I do want to say that, in my view, if we ask the question, does the UN have a future? The UN should have a future because it's even more indispensable today in the world of the 21st century than it was in 1945. If recent history has shown us anything, it is that today, whether you're from Durham, North Carolina, Durham, England, or Durham, South Africa, whether you're a citizen of India, Italy, or Iran, it is simply no longer realistic to think only in terms of your own country. Global forces press in from every conceivable direction. People, goods, and ideas cross borders and cover vast distances with ever greater frequency, speed, and ease. We're increasingly connected through travel, through trade, through the internet, what we watch, what we eat, even the games we play. Indeed, one consequence of the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, in London, in Madrid and Mumbai, in Old Bali and New Delhi, is that even those countries that once felt insulated from external dangers by their wealth, their strength, or their distance, now realize that the safety of their citizens depends not only on local arrangements, on local police or security forces, but on international cooperation to guard against terrorism. But not just terrorism, also to ward off the global spread of pollution, of diseases, of illegal drugs, and of weapons of mass destruction. But not just that negative sense, also in a very positive way. Your security depends also on promoting human rights, on promoting democracy, on promoting development around the world. And in our increasingly globalized world, jobs everywhere depend not only on local firms and factories, but on faraway markets for the goods they produce, products they buy, on licenses and access from foreign governments, on an international environment that allows the free movement of goods and persons, and on international institutions that ensure stability. In short, on the international system constructed back in 1945. And so in 2007, I would argue that the need for a universal means for global governance, a mechanism for international cooperation, indeed, let us call it by its name, for a United Nations, is stronger than ever. But as I've just suggested, the world has changed. And if we are to answer affirmatively the question posed in my title, the United Nations must change with it. Now, I can personally vouch for the UN's ability to change. The UN has not just changed enormously in its first 6 decades, it has been transformed in the career span of this one UN official standing before you. If I'd even suggested to my seniors when I joined the organization nearly 29 years ago that the UN would one day observe and even run elections in sovereign states, that it would conduct intrusive inspections for weapons of mass destruction, that it would impose comprehensive sanctions on the entire import-export trade of a member state, that it would create a counter-terrorism committee to monitor national actions against terrorists, that it would send in human rights monitors into a kingdom to see how the monarch was treating his own subjects, that it would set up international criminal tribunals and coerce governments into handing over their citizens to be tried by foreigners under international law. If I'd suggested any of these things, I'm sure my seniors would have told me that I simply did not understand what the United Nations was all about. And indeed, since this was the late 70s, they'd have probably said to me, "Young man, what are you smoking?" And yet, the UN has done every one of these things during the last 29 years that I've worked for it, and more. The UN, in short, has been a highly adaptable institution that has evolved in response to changing times. And the problems without passports that I mentioned earlier, problems like climate change and environmental degradation, but also terrorism, also avian flu, you pick your topic, they're only amenable to international remedy. You can't fence off your climate, you can't protect yourself against the flight paths of birds carrying the flu virus. Obviously, all of this ensures that the only way you can tackle these problems is by putting them at the top of the UN's agenda. Now, that's not to say the UN can afford to rest on its laurels. The UN indeed must be reformed, but not as some people would have you believe, because it has failed, or because it's irremediably corrupt, or because it's a bureaucratic nightmare, or all of those other things, and we can talk about them in more detail, Professor, behind the woodshed. But my argument is the UN needs to be reformed because it has succeeded enough to be worth investing in. The need for reform has become clear in recent years. We live in a time when divisions of the UN have led to genuine worries that the old East-West divide is being replaced by a new and equally serious North-South divide. Some diplomats and academic observers are even speaking today of a crisis in the international system. I think we can readily agree that some of the challenges we face are not the same as the ones of 1945. And it's also true that in 2007 we're still only making progress towards a consensus comparable to that of 1945 on how to make the world more secure. I'm sure that you've heard many of the questions that have been raised over the past few years. When is the use of force permissible and who should decide? Is preventive war sometimes justified, or is it simply aggression under another name? Is humanitarian intervention a moral imperative, or merely a mask for a new imperialism? And even in a world that has become somewhat unipolar, what role should the United Nations play in regulating the use of force by any of the big powers? And add to this the very fair points the professor made, the Volcker inquiry into allegations of corruption in the Oil for Food program, though I do want to stress it found practically no corruption amongst the UN personnel, did bring into harsh relief some serious deficiencies in the UN's management practices. And with all of this, the result was, to say the least, a crisis of confidence. But you know, we speak a lot of languages at the UN. In fact, one of the many titles I'll be relinquishing is that of the UN's Coordinator for Multilingualism. And my Chinese friends tell me that in their language, the Chinese character for crisis is actually made up of two other characters, the character for danger and the character for opportunity. So we've seen the danger implicit in this question, but I think we can seize the opportunity. With a little prompting from various experts, both within and without the UN Secretariat, some 170 world leaders, the largest ever gathering of heads of state and government in human history, met at the UN World Summit in September of 2005 and agreed on a plan to reshape the international architecture for the 21st century. There are several serious and important lacunae in the document these world leaders produced, but the stage was set for some much-needed change. To give you a few examples, the gathering resulted in a promise to provide an additional $50 billion to fight poverty by 2010. And will all that money come, and will all of it be put to the best use? I think we live in an imperfect world, and experience teaches us that the answer to both of those questions will probably be no. But have no doubt that if governments come even close to meeting this commitment, the money, the resources can really help make the world a safer and fairer place. Much was made at the time of the failure of the summit to deliver a formal legal definition of terrorism. But what few seemed to notice was that for the first time ever, governments all agreed we received a clear and unqualified condemnation of terrorism, and I'm quoting here, in all its forms and manifestations, committed by whomever, wherever, and for whatever purposes. This was clearly an advance on the endless debates over the justness of the cause, rather than the innocent lives lost as a result of these actions. The next step is a comprehensive convention against terrorism, something that still seems a step too far for some governments. But in matters of international law, we move forward in increments, and this was an important if incremental achievement. Because too many states were sliding back into conflict once the UN peacekeepers had finished their jobs and departed, a new peace-building commission was established, charged with ensuring that there was coherent and sustained support for countries to ensure a continuum from conflict through peacekeeping to democratic institution building and development, so you can actually go from war to peace building. Of course, it's early days for this, but again, the idea is to ensure that people who have succeeded in laying down their arms should stand a better chance of building a stable, long-term peace. And indeed, the World Summit created a special fund to support democracy and democratization, to which some $50 million has already been pledged by about 21 different countries. And not just countries from the rich world. One of the leading donors, I'm pleased to say, is the government of India. Now, since the summit, there's also been a lot of talk about the reform of the UN administration. And I do want to say that you probably wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in the United Nations, but I suspect that even the most committed multilateralist amongst you would be taxed by an account of the detailed administrative changes proposed to the UN's recruitment and budgeting regulations. But I'd be very happy during our Q&A period to go into more detail about the attempts being made to empower the UN's management to take decisions about how best to fulfill the organization's mandates, while at the same time, of course, being more accountable for these decisions. And in this World Summit, by the way, there was also the adoption of a new norm called the responsibility to protect. We had a good discussion on this with some of the students who are here today, just over lunch. But if any one of you is interested in talking about that, I'd be very glad to address it. It's an important advance in the notion that sovereignty doesn't just come with rights for states, it comes with obligations to protect the well-being of their own people. There's all of this happening, a great deal of more change underway. The new Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, has made some proposals on restructuring the peacekeeping efforts of the UN. We can talk about that if you like. We currently have over 100,000 people, a record, once you count both soldiers and civilians, serving in 18 different peacekeeping missions around the world. And these people on the front line deserve stronger and better support from home. But all of this, of course, brings me back to the question about the future. With all of this change, and with the jury still out in some of these efforts, can I tell you in confidence what the UN will look like in the future? Perhaps not, but since I am leaving it, let me venture a sketch of what I think it should look like. The UN is and must continue to be, in my view, a forum where the rich and powerful can commit their strength and their wealth to the cause of a better world. And it must continue to provide the stage where great and proud nations, big and small, rich and poor, can meet as equals to iron out their differences and find common cause in their shared humanity. The UN, it's always been my view, will only succeed if it is a recourse for all and not the instrument of a few. Development must continue to be a major priority for the UN of the future. Despite its remarkable successes in helping pull millions out of poverty in recent years, Asia cannot afford to be complacent. Latin America is still not much better off, and Africa continues to struggle. The UN can play the role of holding governments, both rich and poor, to their commitments, the Millennium Development Goals, as they're called, which are frankly not on target, not on course to being fulfilled. And the UN can work to ensure that the world develops mechanisms that should make successful and sustainable development more likely. Now, not all of this will happen at the UN itself. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF in particular, have a key role to play. But the UN remains indispensable as the place where political agreement can be reached on development goals and where the agenda is set on issues that affect the well-being of the overwhelming majority of the world's people. So I have, I hope, painted a picture of the UN of the future as firmly anchored in its achievements, but eagerly engaged in transforming itself in the light of changing circumstances. A refurbished UN, built on the strong foundations laid down in 1945, buttressed by the innovations and the achievements of the last 60 years, and renovated to take account of the problems that have emerged in the course of dealing with the challenges facing us all in the real world. Realistically, it'll probably be a UN that's more sharply focused on areas where it has a proven and undoubted capacity to make a difference. It will, for example, continue to be the first port of call, for all the reasons I mentioned, to coordinate the world's response when major humanitarian disasters strike. It is currently the most successful practitioner and will likely remain the means of choice to monitor peace treaties. And when territories must be administered while political solutions evolve and the modus operandi for lasting peace are established, I'm sure the world will continue to turn to the UN since it transcends any one government's interests but acts in the name of all. It will not, I imagine, lead the kind of military interventions that we call peace enforcement, as distinct from peacekeeping. But its legislative bodies, particularly the Security Council, and I'm sure some of you will want to talk about the reform of that body, will undoubtedly remain the primary source of legitimacy for any such interventions. But where others have the capacity, the resources, the will to keep the peace, for example, it could be NATO in Afghanistan, the EU in Bosnia, I hope the African Union in many parts of the African continent, then the UN should stand aside and bless their efforts. Where others lack the resources, as is the case with the AU in Darfur, the UN should press as hard as it can to establish partnerships that will work and provide the support that is indispensable. And where the task enforcing peace in Iraq, for instance, is clearly beyond the UN, it should offer political counsel and humanitarian assistance, but let wars be fought by warriors, not by peacekeepers. I recognize that the clock has moved on quite a bit, and I really did want to have an exchange with you all. We are all always like Egyptian mummies, pressed for time. So let me try and bring this to a conclusion. As you've gathered from my response to the question of our title, I can see no other entity that could, with the same efficiency and objectivity, provide the means to address the gaps and the cracks in the facade of the international system through which many of the 21st century's problems, from environmental degradation to global epidemics to human rights abuses to international terrorism, would otherwise prosper. But so much for the architecture. As the old saying goes, however, a house is not a home. Something more, something equally important but not quite so tangible, is also needed before we can be happy that our organization, as I called it, is all it can be in the 21st century. And that is, at some level, very simple, which is why I talked about the founding of the body. At this time of turbulence and transformation, the UN must find, this new UN of the future must find a way to encapsulate the 21st century's equivalent of the spirit that informed its founding. It must amplify the voices of those who would otherwise not be heard, and it must serve as a canopy beneath which all can feel secure. The UN of the future must never forget that it is both a child of hope and a source of hopes for a better world, hopes that all human beings share. I talked at the beginning about some of the negatives that we at the UN are used to hearing from a certain capital city not that far away from here. But you know, years ago there used to be a bumper sticker, I'm sure there's some still stuck on a few fenders in North Carolina, that said, it's time to get the US out of the UN and the UN out of the US. Whenever I saw that bumper sticker, I was reminded of a dreadful old story about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It turns out that Adam finds that Eve is becoming a bit indifferent to him. So Adam says to Eve, Eve, is there someone else? And you think about that for a minute, because you could ask the same question about the United Nations. Is there an alternative? Is there any other institution that can bring all the countries of the world together, not to give up their sovereignties, but to work together in pursuit of solutions to the problems we all share, and ultimately, perhaps, to dream the same dreams together? There isn't one. This is the only UN we have. Let's work together to ensure it's the best UN it can be as we go on into the 21st century. Thank you very much.